Good morning, everyone. I'm so sorry that I couldn't be with you today. This is an important conference with a wonderful slate of speakers. And the topic that Jerry asked me to speak about is, in fact, incredibly important. So I hope the influence of this conference spreads throughout the country, that everyone gets a chance to think hard about some of the issues we're going to be talking about. My own topic was recognizing stress in infants, children, and toddlers and how to protect their spirit. And my thinking about this really, in my mind, pivotal issue was profoundly influenced by the work that Stanley was doing with Georgia back in the late 1980s, and then the work that the two of them did with Steve Porges in the early 1990s. And the reason why I think this is so important is because DIR is really grounded in an understanding of the nature of stress, which goes all the way back to Walter Cannon and all the way forward, if you like, to Connie Lillis and Janice Turnbull. So our understanding of stress is really so much more sophisticated than, say, what one finds in the popular press, where stress is really identified with things like social pressures, the pressures of job or time, whatever. Those are stresses, there's no doubt about it. But for us, stress is a much more pervasive phenomenon. So our definition of stress, going back to Cannon, is essentially anything that triggers the release of energy from the brainstem in order to keep some internal system within an optimal homeostatic range. So that's what a stressor is for us. And if we go back to Stan and George's early work, what they were interested in were the stresses, the sort of biological / environmental stresses of the birth phenomena and the first year of life. And there's a wonderful book about this that Daphne Mora wrote called The World of the Newborn. And Mora makes the following point. Look, a fetus does, of course, experience stress. So we now know through the work of people like Tiffany Fields that they they can be profoundly affected by the stress of the mother. And there is a second aspect that is very interesting, and that is that in the third trimester, we've now been able to see, scientists saw this last summer, the baby can in fact have a fight or flight reaction to things like a loud noise. Now, which tells us that the limbic alarm is in fact, in the amygdala, is in fact already functional by the third trimester. And it's quite fascinating to see how the fetus's reaction to, say, a loud noise is essentially the same, the same heightened tension, elevated heart rate, etc., that we would see in a newborn. But of course, that's a relatively isolated phenomenon for a fetus. So by and large, the fetus is developing in an environment which really does minimize, or at least we hope it minimizes, the reaction of the HPA pathway. Of course, there are all kinds of stressors, like chemical stressors, alcohol, or the work that Phil Landrigan has been doing, which tells us how environmental stressors can, in fact, also pass through the blood-brain barrier and affect fetal development. But we hope that by and large, the fetus is relatively protected. And of course, all of that begins to change quite dramatically in the birth experience. So, going down the birth canal, being pushed and squeezed, and then being born. And this is what Morrow's book is about, the incredible explosion of stress that the newborn experiences. For the first time, sounds, temperature, the newborn now has to cope with a number of internal sensations, for example, with metabolism and elimination that it's never experienced before. So birth really is quite a stressful phenomenon. And we want to show you now a short video, which I think is one of the most interesting illustrations of what I want to talk to you about today and what Jerry wanted me to talk about. Both the stress that the newborn experiences and the role of the interbrain, the role of the caregiver in helping this poor defenseless creature cope with the phenomenal stress it's experiencing. So Susan's going to show you now this little clip of Michael Jr. There are so many aspects of this little video that we could probably spend a full day analyzing what we've just seen. The first is the fact that this newborn little girl is really in a state of profound limbic hyperarousal. This is overwhelming her, and you can see, of course, I mean, it goes without saying, she has literally no capacity to calm herself, to turn off the limbic alarm. Now, the interesting question in all this is, why does Michael Jr.'s voice have that effect? And that is actually a very interesting physiological question. So, you can just imagine, suppose that dad, who's been present during the birth, was now in a state of utter hysteria because of the trauma of watching his wife give birth. And instead of responding the way Michael Jr. does, father is shrieking, "Oh my God, what do I do? What do I do?" So it goes without saying that that is not going to help. Or suppose the baby is left to itself. Suppose there is no one that attends to this distraught little creature. Eventually she'll stop crying, but only from sheer exhaustion, not because she has, in fact, calmed herself down. That's an utter absurdity. So then we start to look at what he says and the way he says it. And the interesting question here is, why does the sound of his voice instantly have a soothing effect? And what it's telling us is that she actually recognizes her father's voice. We now know that the fetus first recognizes the mother's voice, and then as fetal development continues, a couple of weeks later, her hearing now picks up the lower tones of the male voice. So what this is telling us is that Michael Jr. has, in fact, been most likely speaking to his baby through mommy's tummy during the third trimester, and probably saying all sorts of very soothing things. And the point here is that this is, in fact, the secret to why she calms down instantly is because she recognizes daddy's voice. There is a further aspect of this, and that's what he actually says. And it's fascinating to see this father's instinct, which is to protect, to calm. All of the messages that he gives his newborn baby daughter are, "Daddy's here to protect you." And these messages are coming deep from within his own brain, deep from within his limbic system. This is not premeditated. He's probably not even aware of what he's saying. This is an instinct probably born from experiences that he himself had. And then there's the fact of the very tone of his voice, which has this instant soothing effect. And we now know from Porges's work on the role of prosody in, producing these feelings of safety and security, that what the baby is responding to here is this very primitive mechanism that we have that goes straight to the hypothalamus and turns off the alarm, and it's this slow, low-toned, soothing vocalizations. Not the words are irrelevant. And this was one of the points that Stanley would make over and over, that really what the baby is responding to is how you say something and not what, because that's still a year away before it even starts. So a very interesting little clip, and what it tells us is this fundamental message that I've been talking about for a few years now, the importance of secondary altriciality, the importance of the fact that if we had a chance, and I hope that Susan's showing the picture of the triune brain now, if we could actually redo that triune brain to represent what it looks like at birth, what we would see is that neocortex would be really substantially smaller than what's depicted. It's that part of the brain, and especially the prefrontal part of that neocortex, which is going to explode at the moment of birth and will continue to grow at a furious pace for the next 6.5 years. So what it tells us is it's a very vivid example of the importance of the higher order brain that has that developed neocortex, has those executive functions, the role that they play in soothing, in reducing the stress response, turning it off. And once that happens, then of course that causes the shift that Porges made so famous, the shift from ergotropic to tropotrophic. In the case of a newborn, what we're really looking at, which is what Stanley and Georgia were studying and what Steve was studying, is the importance of turning off that alarm in order to promote all those vegetative, those metabolic functions, the growth, the recovery, and then we get into the work that Stan was about to start, the development of those pattern recognition systems in the prefrontal cortex that are going to be so essential for language development, for social cognition, social awareness, self-awareness, and so on. So we have a picture here of stress as something that really in the earliest part of life is very much biological and environmental, and the role that this can play in obstructing, in impeding the child's capacity to get to the second phase, the second stage of DIR, the stage of engagement, which sets the platform for learning, which sets the platform for observing the world around you, beginning, of course, with your caregiver. When we study stress reactions in infancy, what we're really interested in the sort of SelfReg framework that we are working within at TMC, what we're interested in is the role that the caregiver, the absolutely pivotal role that the caregiver will play in turning off that limbic alarm as the baby is becoming much more aware, much more alert, in much the same way that Michael Jr. turns off the alarm in his newborn baby daughter. So now what I'm going to do is ask Susan to show you one more video. And this is a video that Steve Porges sent me of baby Emerson, and he is 8 months old in this clip. Okay, so again, we could do a very interesting analysis of what we've just seen here. And you can see how um, here we have an 8-month-old who goes into fight or flight, even though he can't yet walk, let alone run. And in fact, were it not for the case that he was strapped into his high seat, he probably would have toppled right over. So that's an indication of how strong this limbic system is, this fight or flight system, limbic and reptilian, and how it is essential for the caregiver to recognize the fight or flight, recognize the alarm, and turn it off, because Emerson can't do it for himself. And if you think about what you've just seen, you can see a vivid example of this shift that people like Julian Ford talk about, the shift from survival brain to learning brain. When he goes into fight or flight, into survival brain, he is, completely focused on the threat. Completely, all of his systems now are prepared for survival, and there's very little capacity for learning. So what has to happen is Mummy has to turn off the alarm. And again, we see the incredible power of the voice, of prosody, as a mechanism, an interbrain mechanism for turning off the alarm. So her cadence, she's speaking, it's all the tones of motherese are turning off the alarm. And now we have added to that a couple of more aspects, a couple of more elements that will become part of the baby's pattern recognition. We have her smile. We know she's smiling. Her eyes are sparkling. There's a slight laugh. So now what the baby is associating are those facial expressions, the sound of her voice, all of which is telling him you are safe. So what will happen is, it's fascinating to see how we get the same fight or flight reaction 4 or 5 times. But eventually he's going to learn that this explosion coming out of Mummy's nose is not in fact a threat, that it is what we call a sneeze. And, his neocortex will remember this, as indeed will his hippocampus. I'll come back to that in 1 second. So this pattern, this information will get stored, and he's learned now that sneezes are not in fact a danger. But there is another memory that's incredibly important here, and that's the hippocampal one. And that's the memory that Mummy made me safe. Mummy was there when I was scared. And you think about how many times a baby, in this case an infant, is going to have these kinds of experiences, which it cannot regulate on its own yet, which it can't turn off its own alarm yet. And so we need that. What Bowlby's what Bowlby would describe as the source of secure attachment, which is about to really provide that foundation for exploring the world, knowing that you have that sense of safety and security coming from the other aspect, the other half of your interbrain. And we talk so much in DIR about the importance of positive emotions for fueling the growth of the mind, to use Stan's term. And we have to remember that the first emotion we're looking at, the first feeling, again using Stanley, is this feeling of emotionally safe, of being safe and secure because of a caregiver that you see as this protective force. As this idea began to really take off in the 1980s and 90s, it gave birth to this. Tremendous interest in what became known as sensitive caregiving, because of course the point here is that the mom has to see that Emerson has gone into fight or flight. The mom has to recognize in her baby the signs of when he's gone into, when his limbic alarm has been triggered, and then she has to know how to turn it off. And it's important to try to come to terms with the sort of uh, limbic communication. This is something that Stanley and I talked about in the first idea. This limbic system to limbic system communication, or what Alan Shore describes as the right brain to right brain communication, that's going on here, because this isn't something where she analyzes. Mommy doesn't say, well, the baby's just done this, this, and this. That means that my baby's alarm has gone off, so I should do this, this, and this. Rather, what's going on here is her perception is automatic, and her reaction is automatic. Just like Michael Jr. in the delivery room, she instantly goes into soothing behavior to turn off the alarm. And that's an important point, because so much of the work that was done around sensitive caregiving took a sort of cognitive or even a metacognitive approach to this issue, that what mommy needed, what moms who were having problems in attachment needed, was some sort of instruction, needed to be taught how to read the signs, what they meant, and how to behave, how to respond. But that's not what we see happening here. And really what we see happening here, again, was a point that Stanley picked up very early, and in my opinion, one of the most groundbreaking works that has appeared in the literature around this theme was the book that Stanley and his colleagues published in 1987, Infants in Multi-Risk Families. These were infants that were, for many different reasons, experiencing an attachment disorder. And the team, the precursor of 0 to 3, what they did was not what we would call parent instruction. Instead, they did what I would describe as SelfReg. And so they worked very hard with the moms, addressing the kinds of different kinds of stresses that they were experiencing. So addressing the stresses of the mother and helping them develop self-regulating strategies. And perhaps, modeling, because in so many of these cases, these were moms that hadn't experienced the sort of soothing, having their own alarm turned off when they were babies. So what it tells us is that when you can turn off the mother's own alarm, some very interesting things happen. One of the things that happens is the mother is not frightened or does not herself go into fight or flight by things that are occurring with her baby. But the other thing that happens, which is fascinating, is that her own capacity to see the signs, to recognize when her baby has gone into fight or flight or freeze, that part of the social brain comes back online as we can turn off the mother's alarm. But of course, there's a further issue, and it's this last issue that takes us really more into the sort of 3 to 6-year-old range, and that's the whole issue of cognitive blinders. And we noticed something very interesting in our work at Mary, and that was that by and large, parents understood that their infant, so let's say, in the first 2 years of life, that the infant really wasn't aware of, what they were doing, wasn't being manipulative, didn't need it to be scolded or whatever. But something seems to happen once kids get language, once they start to be able to, describe what they're feeling or ask for things. Because now parents we saw this so many times that they started to see their 3-year-old even through very different through sort of very different lens than the way they saw their baby. Now they thought the child, was capable of exercising self-control. Their child needed to be taught how to make a greater effort to, that they would have to suffer consequences for behaving in a certain way. And so we began to really explain to parents this difference, which is fundamental to SelfReg, this difference between misbehavior and stress behavior. And I was fascinated how in the beginning, there was a certain amount of, when we introduced these ideas, there was a certain amount of resistance because the self-control paradigm has such a long history in Western thinking and is so deeply entrenched that even when you would explain all this, explain what the signs of stress behavior are, the automatic was still to go back into the sort of punishment and reward mindset that a child has to be forced to behave. And we began to coach our parents on using the same sort of tools that, say, a physician, a pediatrician might use when they're teaching parents the different, the signs of when your child is sick. So, many parents don't know what the significance of, say, glassy eyes and flush face are in terms of, the child's physical well-being. So we teach them, and we have lots of books about this, here are the signs of an illness and here's what to do. Well, that's exactly what we were doing with teaching the signs of stress behavior. There are quite distinctive signs of stress behavior. And so we might look at things like the pallor, the color of the child's face, or the child's eyes, what even their pupils, all kinds of signs of stress behavior, or what the child is actually doing. The heightened impulsivity, the volatility, the emotional volatility, all kinds of signs of stress behavior. And what was probably the biggest obstacle in explaining these ideas was that these very behaviors were the things that, according to the self-control paradigm, are the behaviors that need to be suppressed through an act of willpower or effort. And what we had to show was that how by identifying what the stressors were that the child was experiencing, and remembering the lesson we'd learned, the canon lesson about the nature of stress, looking at physiological, biological stresses, as well as social, emotional, cognitive, that those challenging or problematic behaviors begin to dissipate simply as a function of reducing the stress. Of course, what's really going on here is we are reducing that limbic arousal, which allows the prefrontal cortex to come back online, which allows systems like the medial prefrontal, the dorsolateral, and the subgenual to exercise, appraisal, reappraisal, self-awareness, and so on and so on. And so what we were doing is really what is the heart of steps 3, 4, 5, and 6 in DIR, allowing these, allowing the growth of the mind, what Stanley calls the growth of the mind. But there is a further aspect of this, and I'll make this my last point before Susan takes over, because the other thing we noticed was that this really is an interbrain phenomenon. And what I mean by that is that what we were doing was really scaffolding both sides, both polarities, the caregiver as much as the child, or infant, baby infant child. So you can't reduce the stress of one without reducing the stress of the other. And in fact, if you think about it, the more self-regulated the caregiver is, then it goes without saying that the better able they will be to help their baby become regulated and engaged. So that's my final thought for for my little section today, that what we're trying to do is we're really trying to reduce limbic arousal in both sides. And that's the real secret to protecting the spirit of this precious being, of the infant or the child. And what we've done is, for various reasons, focused on the 5 steps of SelfReg. And the more I've looked at this, and really as a function of the kind of response we've received from teachers and now parents throughout Canada, what we've seen is that we are living in a time where stress is very, very high. And we're particularly concerned with those hidden stresses that exert such a terrible toll on the nervous system without our even recognize it, on our own as a caregiver, on our child, on our developing child. So what we hope to accomplish is, when we work on the first stage, the reframing stage, is that once you get that kind of aspect shift from a self-control mindset to a self-regulation mindset, once a parent begins to recognize this and understand the thinking behind it, what happens is this incredible inquisitiveness. What are the stresses that are the underlying cause of whatever it is that I'm seeing my child, whether it's in terms of their attention, their mood, or their behavior. And then we can start to look at how we can reduce those stresses, how we can develop stress awareness in our child, and finally, what works as a, let's call it a self-regulating practice. And that, of course, brings us back to the very early emphasis that Stanley and Georgia were making on individual differences, because that's pivotal to doing SelfReg. There isn't one size fits all. We talk about, instead of buying a suit off the rack, everything we do is bespoke, custom made, custom tailoring. So we help, if we've gone through the first 4 stages of SelfReg with our families, they are now in a position where they can, in fact, begin to do that sort of trial and error learning, experimenting, which will help them identify, develop self-regulating strategies that work for their child, bearing in mind that the child will be changing all the time, and that what works in one moment may not work in the next. But I think I can safely say now, and I know that Susan's this is really going to be the starting point for what she's going to talk about in the next half. What we can safely say now is that the explosion that we've seen in our SelfReg initiatives across Canada tells us 2 things. 1, that the need is there. And 2, that in fact these ideas are profoundly beneficial for the parent as much as for the child. And I even find, as I talk about these things, I may have to do yet another blog for the SelfReg view, because I find it enormously regulating, just thinking about problems that we have been struggling with as clinicians and psychologists for the last 30 years. And now we can see how modern neuroscience and physiology are really helping us to make sense of ideas that, it turns out, were first recognized in 1987, 1986. But I find that I find that deeply reassuring, and I hope you do too. So have a good conference, everyone.